The first bullet hit the porch lantern half a second after the German Shepherd slammed 70-year-old Frank Mercer backward into the cabin wall. Glass exploded across the doorway. The yellow light died instantly, and the mountain night swallowed the whole porch in black silence broken only by rain, wind, and the echo of the shot that should have gone through Frank's chest. But Frank did not breathe. Old age had slowed his knees, not his instincts. He hit the floor hard, rolled behind the wood stove, and reached for the revolver he still kept hidden under the side shelf, while the Black Antin Shepherd planted himself between Frank and the front door like a living shield, teeth out, ears forward, staring into the dark as if he could already see the men coming through the storm. Another shot tore through the window frame above them. Splinters rained down. Frank's jaw locked. This was no random break-in. No drunk hunter. No desperate thief. Whoever was outside had come here to kill him.
Rex, can't hold on!
Frank whispered, and the German Shepherd answered with one low growl so deep it sounded less like fear and more like a warning from something that had already measured death and decided to fight it. Frank Mercer had lived alone on that mountain for 6 years, ever since his wife, Helen, died in winter and left the whole cabin too quiet to breathe in. Ashwood County thought of him as just an old widower now, gray-haired, stiff-backed, retired, a man who chopped his own wood and minded his own business. But long before he became the old man on the ridge, Frank Mercer had been the kind of soldier who could read danger from the way silence changed shape. And right now silence was telling him one ugly truth. The men outside knew exactly where he lived, exactly how to box him in, and exactly when to strike. Rex suddenly left the front door and rushed to the hallway leading toward the cellar steps. He did not bark wildly. He blocked the path. Frank's eyes narrowed. "Not there, too," he muttered, but the dog stood firm, shoulder braced, body rigid, refusing to let him pass. Then came the sound, not from outside, but from below the house. A dull metallic thud. Then another. Then one long dragging scrape from somewhere near the cellar door, as if something heavy had shifted in the dark underneath the floorboards. Frank turned slowly toward the basement hall. He had not gone down there in months. Ever since Helen died, that basement had become a grave of old boxes, tools, and memories he didn't want touching. But Rex was not simply afraid of it. He was stopping him from going there. That changed everything. Frank crouched, flashlight in one hand, revolver in the other, and swept the beam low across the hallway floor. First nothing. Then the light caught a hair-thin wire stretched across the third cellar step, nearly invisible in the gloom. Frank followed it with the beam and saw what waited at the other end, an old shotgun rigged against the stair frame, aimed straight at the chest of whoever took one more step down. Frank's blood went cold. Somebody had been inside his house before tonight. Somebody had turned his own basement into a death trap. Rex looked back at him once, breathing hard, as if to say, "I told you." Then a voice came from outside the front porch, calm, male, and terrifyingly sure of itself. "Frank Mercer," the man called through the rain. "You can keep hiding if you want, but we both know you're too old to survive this night." Frank's face hardened. He knew that voice. He had not heard it in 22 years, but memory did not forget certain kinds of evil. Cole Vanner. Private contractor. Smuggler. The man Frank thought had died overseas in a fire and left his sins buried with him. But Cole Vanner was alive, standing outside Frank's cabin in the storm with armed men and a sniper angle, and somehow he knew Frank was here. Rex's growl deepened. Frank tightened his grip on the revolver. "So that's what this is," he whispered. "Not robbery. Not random violence. A hunt. And if Cole Vanner had climbed all the way up this mountain to find him, then the past Frank Mercer had spent 20 years burying had finally found the door." The rain intensified. Another beam moved outside the side window. Then a second. 3 men at least. Frank took one slow breath and looked at Rex. The dog was no longer focused only on the porch. He kept flicking his eyes toward the old bookshelf beside the fireplace, the one place in the cabin Frank never let anyone touch. Frank's pulse hit harder, because hidden inside the hollow back panel of that shelf was a rusted military lockbox he had not opened in decades. And if Rex was warning him away from the basement, but pulling his attention toward that shelf, then the dog understood something impossible. The reason these men had come was not just to kill an old man. They had come for whatever Frank Mercer had hidden all these years. Then, from outside the front door, Cole Vanner spoke again, quieter now, almost amused. "Frank," he called, "bring me the box, and I might let the dog live." The threat against the dog changed everything, because Frank Mercer could hear a lie when it came wrapped in patience, and Cole Vanner was not the kind of man who spared anything that could track, remember, or testify. Rex's growl turned into a hard, violent bark that cracked through the cabin like a command, and Frank moved at once, not toward the front door, not toward the basement, but toward the bookshelf beside the fireplace where the hollow back panel waited behind 30 years of untouched history. Another bullet punched through the log wall above his shoulder before he got there, showering him in splinters and insulation, and only Rex's body slamming into the back of his leg kept him low enough to stay alive. "I know," Frank muttered, breath tight, forcing his fingers around the carved wood edge of the shelf until the hidden panel gave with a dry snap. Behind it sat the rusted military lockbox exactly where he had buried it 22 years ago, and exactly where he had hoped never to touch it again. Vanner's voice drifted in from the porch, almost friendly now, which only made it meaner. "You always did make this harder than it needed to be, Frank." The old man dragged the box down, dropped behind the couch with Rex braced over him, and spun the combination lock by touch alone. His hands remembered the code before his mind wanted to. The lid sprang open, and the first thing he saw was Helen's photograph tucked over the contents. Helen younger, laughing, hair whipped by mountain wind, one hand shading her eyes while she stood beside the same porch that was now burning. Under the photo sat a weather-sealed drive, a compact pistol, 2 loaded magazines, a brass key stamped cold room, and a folded envelope with his name written in Helen's handwriting. For one dangerous second the room narrowed around that handwriting. Then the side window burst inward. Glass sprayed over the stove. A man in dark rain gear came through low with a knife and a silenced pistol, fast enough to kill any frightened old widower who hesitated, and just slow enough to die in Frank Mercer's living room instead. Rex hit him midair. The shepherd crashed into the man's ribs with such force that both of them slammed across the kitchen threshold, and Frank saw the muzzle angle down toward the dog's neck. He fired once from the floor. The round caught the intruder in the upper chest and flung him sideways into the pantry door. The silenced pistol clattered away into the dark. Rex wheeled instantly back toward Frank, not celebrating, not checking the body, already hunting the next angle. Good dog. Good enough to know this was only the beginning. Smoke was thickening fast now, rolling down from the rafters as the porch flames spread under the eaves. Frank ripped Helen's envelope open because Vanner had come too far and too prepared for the contents of that box to be anything smaller than the reason for the whole night. A single note fell out. "If this box is open, then either I died too soon or the lie got close enough to reach our door. Don't trust the sheriff. Don't trust the accident report. If Vanner comes back, take the drive to the cold room and watch it there, not here." Frank felt something cold and ancient slide under his ribs. Sheriff Nolan Reeves had signed Helen's winter crash report 6 years ago. Reeves had stood beside the casket. Reeves had promised the road crew records matched the storm. Reeves had looked Frank in the eyes and told him no one could have saved her. Another kick hammered the front door. The deadbolt bent inward with a squeal of metal. Vanner was done waiting. Frank grabbed the drive, the key, the spare magazines, and Helen's note, then scooped up the compact pistol and shoved the whole mess into his coat while Rex planted himself at the hall entrance and barked toward the back mudroom. Not the front. The rear. Someone else was coming in. Frank cut across the kitchen just as the mudroom latch began to rise from outside. He slammed his shoulder into the door and felt a body on the other side shove back. Hard. Young. Strong. For half a second wood, bone, and weather collided in one locked point. Then Rex launched past Frank's hip and hit the panel at chest height the instant the latch broke. The man outside gave a startled cry and stumbled back off the steps into the rain. Frank fired blind through the lower half of the door. A scream answered him from the dark. He did not stay to confirm it. The front door finally gave way behind him with a splintering crash, and Vanner's men flooded the front room with wet boots and flashlight beams. "Kitchen side!" someone shouted. "He's moving!" Frank shoved the old cold room door hidden behind the flour bins, jammed the brass key into the slot, and yanked it open while smoke and flashlight beams cut through the pantry slats behind him. The cold room was not a normal cellar pantry. It was the kind of mountain storage chamber old houses had once used for root vegetables, meat, and things better kept buried in stone than displayed in daylight. Helen had made Frank reinforce it years earlier after one bad winter, and later, after Kandahar, after Vanner, after a convoy that should never have happened. Frank had made sure it had a second interior latch no county permit had ever seen. He pushed himself and Rex inside, slammed the thick insulated door, and dropped the bar just as rounds thudded into the outer wood. Darkness swallowed them, but only for a breath. Then Frank found the emergency lamp hook, yanked the cord, and a weak red glow filled the stone room. Shelves of jars, old tools, hanging hooks, one narrow vent shaft, and a work table. Safe for seconds, maybe a minute. Not forever. Boots thundered in the pantry outside. Somebody was already hitting the door with something heavy. Rex stood between Frank and the entrance, chest heaving, for dark with rain and bits of glass, ears locked so hard forward they seemed carved. Frank set the drive on the work table, snapped the old field tablet out of the box, and fed the storage seal into the port. The machine flickered to life with a low whine. Static. A dark screen. Then video. Dashcam footage. Night. Snow. A mountain road. Frank went still because he knew that road before the first turn came into frame. Knew the curve. Knew the guardrail. Knew the old mile marker half buried under winter brush. Helen's truck appeared in the distance, taillights glowing red through the storm, moving carefully, too carefully for a woman who knew the road as well as she did unless she already felt something behind her. Headlights swelled in the dashcam frame. A second vehicle came fast out of the snow and closed on her bumper with deliberate, terrifying precision. Frank's fingers locked around the work table edge. "No," he whispered, not because he doubted the screen, but because his body had not yet caught up to what his eyes already knew. The pursuing truck tapped Helen's rear bumper once. Her truck fishtailed. Recovered. Then the second hit came harder. Deliberate. Measured. Not weather. Not ice. Murder. Helen's truck broke sideways toward the ravine as the dashcam vehicle braked just enough for the image to sharpen on the driver through the windshield glare. Frank leaned in as if fury alone could change the past. The face behind the wheel turned for one cold, awful second under the snow-smeared light, and Frank saw Sheriff Nolan Reeves as clearly as if the man were standing in the room with him. Outside the cold room door, the pounding stopped. Vanner's voice came through the thick wood, lower now, almost pleased. "So," he said, "you finally know what really happened to Helen." "So," he said, "you finally know what really happened to Helen." The words hit harder than the bullets had, because bullets only tried to kill Frank Mercer, But that sentence reached backward 6 years and tore open the one wound age had never managed to dull. The little cold room seemed to shrink around him. Red lamp glow on stone walls. Ellie's terrified face half lit beside the work table. Rex planted between them and the door, fur up, lips peeled, staring at the wood as if Cole Vanner's voice itself had a shape he could bite. Frank forced one breath into his lungs and another out, because old men who survived long enough learned one useful thing. When rage came at the wrong second, you either mastered it or it mastered the whole room. He kept his revolver low and answered through the thick door, voice flat as frozen steel.
You used the sheriff to do your dirty work.
Vanner laughed softly on the other side, the sound blurred by smoke and timber and weather.
No, Frank. Reeves used me. Men like him always need somebody uglier nearby so they can pretend they're still decent.
Another dull strike hit the cold room door from outside, not hard enough to break it, just hard enough to remind Frank that the talk was only a weapon buying time. Ellie swallowed and leaned toward the tablet again.
There's more on the drive,
she whispered. Frank gave one short nod without taking his eyes off the door. Rex suddenly swung his head away from Vanner's voice and snapped his stare upward toward the ceiling vent. Not the door. Not the floor. Above. Frank saw it a beat later, fine gray dust falling in a thin line from the vent grate where no dust had moved before. Someone was crawling the ductwork. Of course Vanner would split the pressure, hold the front, slip the top. Frank moved instantly. He crossed left, dragged a hanging meat hook rack beneath the vent, and climbed just enough to angle the revolver up. The grate shifted. One screw dropped. Then a gloved hand pushed through with a suppressor-first pistol. Frank fired point blank through the vent opening. The shot blew the hand backward with a scream that cut off in metal echo, and something heavy crashed through the duct outside the cold room wall. Ellie flinched hard, but Rex didn't waste a heartbeat. The dog launched onto the work table, front paws braced under the vent, growling into the darkness above as if daring the next man to try. Good. One route closed. But Vanner heard the shot too, and the mask of patience slipped out of his voice.
You always were a stubborn bastard,
he called.
That's why Helen died scared.
She thought if she kept driving, she could still get the box away from us.
Frank went still. Ellie looked up sharply. Outside the door, Vanner let the silence stretch because he knew he had landed the blade. Then he twisted it.
She made it to the county line, Frank. Reeves only caught her because she stopped to call you.
Frank's hand tightened so hard on the revolver that the old scars in his knuckles burned. Helen had called him that night. One missed call at 8:47 p.m. from a stretch of road with no service most winters. He had seen it too late, listened to the empty voicemail beep afterward, and lived 6 years with the belief that timing, not murder, had stolen the chance to hear her voice one last time. Ellie's fingers flew over the tablet. The screen jumped, static rolling, then a second file opened. Audio first. Wind. Tires on wet pavement. A woman breathing too fast. Helen. Frank knew it before the camera corrected and showed the blur of dashboard, windshield, and snowlit road.
Frank, if you hear this, don't go home,
she said into the recorder, voice trembling but fighting to stay clear.
The sheriff was at the quarry with Cole. I saw them loading crates under the old conveyor. There's a box in the cabin shelf. Don't let them.
The video jolted violently as headlights flared in the rearview mirror. Ellie covered her mouth. Frank could not move. On screen, Helen looked up once, saw the vehicle behind her gaining, and whispered one word that sounded less like fear than realization.
No.
The impact came a heartbeat later. Metal screamed. The windshield burst with white veins. The camera spun. Helen gasped Frank's name once, and the file cut to black. For one crushing second, even Vanner said nothing outside. Then the door handle turned slowly, testing the bar from the other side. "That recording was your wife trying to save you," he said quietly. "You should have stayed buried with your medals instead." Rex leaped off the table and drove his shoulder into Frank's leg, not toward the door, but toward the back wall under the shelves where sacks of potatoes and canning jars hid the lower stone. Frank followed the line of the dog's body, saw the old iron ring half buried behind the flour bins, and memory hit him at once. Helen's winter latch. Years ago, she had made him carve a secondary ice chute behind the cold room in case a drift buried the main root cellar steps. Frank had laughed when she insisted on the extra work. Helen had only smiled and said old houses needed a second way to breathe. Ellie saw him looking and dropped to her knees, shoving jars aside. "Here?" she whispered. "Help me." The outer door shuddered under a heavier blow. Then another. The hinges complained. Smoke thickened under the threshold, curling in greasy gray tongues across the stone floor. Vanner had stopped trying to talk them into surrender. Now he was going to smoke them out and shoot whoever crawled first. Frank rammed the heel of Ryan's old knife into the mortar seam around the iron ring and pried until the hidden panel cracked loose. Freezing black air poured in from the narrow stone chute beyond, carrying snow, mud, and the deep forest smell of the mountain itself. Small, tight, miserable, alive. "You first," Frank said to Ellie. She shoved the tablet under her coat, slid feet first into the opening, and vanished with one ragged breath. Rex did not wait to be told. He squeezed in after her, shoulders scraping stone, the brass tags on his collar giving one small metallic click in the dark. Frank bent for the lockbox and Helen's photograph. Couldn't help it, wouldn't leave either, and that one extra second almost cost him everything. The cold room door blew inward in a storm of broken wood and sparks. Cole Vanner came through the smoke with a shotgun in his hands and firelight behind him, bigger than Frank remembered, older too, but carrying the same dead calm in his eyes that had followed him through desert convoys and village ash. He saw Frank at the wall opening, saw the box in his hand, and smiled without warmth. "There you are." Frank fired first. Vanner twisted. The round ripped through his coat instead of his heart. The shotgun thundered back, shattering glass, lamp, shelves, and half the stone lip above the chute. Frank dropped into the opening as rock fragments rained over his shoulders. He landed hard on his side in the dark, lockbox still clutched to his chest, Rex barking ahead somewhere below, Ellie scrambling through tight black stone, and above them Vanner's voice followed into the chute like a promise spoken straight into a grave. "Run, Frank," he called. "The sheriff's waiting at the bottom." The warning reached Frank a fraction before the ground disappeared under him. He had one hand clamped around the lockbox, the other scraping uselessly at wet stone, while his boots slid through the narrow ice chute and the cold air knifed up from below. Ellie was already ahead of him somewhere in the dark, breathing too fast, the tablet trapped under her coat, and Rex was moving in short, frantic bursts that made no sense until the dog suddenly launched back uphill and slammed full force into Frank's chest. The old man hit the chute wall hard, shoulders scraping stone, and stopped inches before the bottom opening. A flashlight beam swept across the exit a second later. Frank went completely still. Below the chute mouth, half hidden by sleet and pine shadow, Sheriff Nolan Reeves stood in the ravine with a shotgun angled at the opening, and two armed men spread out on either side of him. One held a lantern low. The other had a rifle pointed straight at the narrow place where Frank's head would have appeared if Rex had let him slide 1 foot farther. That was the first time that night Frank understood the full shape of what his dog was doing. Rex wasn't only warning him about fear or scent or movement. The shepherd was reading death faster than a human could see it. Reeves lifted his light toward the chute and called up calmly, "Frank, if you're alive in there, blink for me." No answer.
The sheriff stepped closer through the sleet, boots crunching on frozen gravel.
Cole said you'd make it to the chute. He also said the dog would be smart enough to keep you alive longer than most men deserve.
Rex's growl rolled low in the dark, but he did not move toward the opening again. He stayed pressed across Frank's legs, forcing him back from the kill zone. Good dog. Good enough to save him twice in the same minute. Ellie had seen the flashlight spill too. She flattened against the side wall of the chute and whispered, barely audible,
"He's got us boxed."
Frank shook his head once.
"No. He's got the obvious exit boxed."
That word mattered. Obvious. Because Rex was no longer staring at Reeves. He had turned away from the opening and was scratching hard at the right-hand wall of the chute where dirt, frost, and old roots had sealed over a narrow seam in the stone. Frank got the message instantly. Another route. Hidden. Tight. Desperate. The kind of route Helen would have known because Helen never trusted one way in or one way out of anything built on a mountain. Frank jammed Ryan's old knife into the seam and pried. The stone face cracked inward with a damp sucking sound, opening into a side crawl barely wide enough for Ellie's shoulders. Below them, Reeves heard something. His voice sharpened.
"Lantern higher."
Light filled the chute. Frank shoved Ellie into the side crawl so hard she almost cried out, then forced the lockbox after her. Rex slid in next like he had been born for tunnels, body twisting through dirt and rock with brutal urgency. Frank came last, dragging the loosened stone slab back into place with his boot just as the main chute mouth lit white under the sheriff's beam. A shotgun blast thundered through the ravine. Stone chips exploded across the crawl wall where Frank's head had been moments earlier.
"Move!"
he hissed. The side passage angled hard through frozen dirt beneath the ravine, downward first, then sideways, then into an old timbered service cut that smelled of wet cedar, old apples, and the cold metallic stink of hidden storage. The storm noise above dimmed into a muffled roar. Ellie crawled fast, terrified enough to be brave. Frank forced his aging body through after her, ribs grinding with every push. Rex moved ahead, then doubled back, then ahead again, never letting either human lose the line. Behind them came the sound Frank least wanted to hear. Reeves laughing. Not loud. Not triumphant. Just the quiet laugh of a man whose trap had failed but whose hunt was still very much alive. A crackle burst through a radio somewhere behind the main chute wall. Reeves answered it immediately.
"He didn't drop."
Dog caught it.
Cole Vetter's voice came back through static, thin but unmistakable.
"I told you the animal would read the opening. You told me Mercer was old."
Reeves replied.
"He is old. He's also still breathing."
Frank crawled faster. The tunnel widened at last into a low stone chamber under the ravine, an abandoned ice room lined with rotten shelving and broken crates. A rusted meat hook swayed slowly from the ceiling beam, moving just enough to show there was air coming from somewhere deeper in. Ellie rolled onto her back, gasping, face gray with dirt and fear. Frank dragged the stone hatch shut behind them and listened. Boots above. Men moving. Searching. But no immediate entry. Not yet. Rex went straight to Ellie, touched his muzzle once against her cheek, as if checking she was still there, then pivoted and planted himself under the ceiling vent, ears locked, eyes burning. Frank finally let himself breathe. Only once. Then he pulled the tablet out from Ellie's coat and set it on an overturned crate. His hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from age, cold, fury, and the aftershock of seeing Reeves waiting like a patient executioner at the end of the chute. The video file from Ellie's father had frozen when the roof shot started. Now the screen blinked once and auto-loaded another file Frank hadn't touched. File name, Helen _2 for 1 full second he couldn't move. Ellie looked at the screen, then at him.
"I didn't open that." "I know."
The file began playing. No dashcam this time. Handheld footage. Shaky. Clothes. Breathing. Snow. Then the image cleared enough for Frank's whole body to lock. Helen Mercer was alive. Not driving. Not in the truck. On her knees in the snow beside the wrecked guardrail, hair full of ice, blood on her temple, one hand gripping the front of Sheriff Reeves's coat while she tried to stay upright. Someone, Ellie's father maybe, or some frightened witness hidden in the storm, was filming from the trees. Reeves looked younger, heavier in the face, but it was him. No doubt. No blur. No maybe. He knelt in front of Helen while the burning truck hissed below the ravine and said, almost gently, "You should have let the box stay buried." Helen looked up at him, dazed and freezing and still somehow fierce. "Frank knows," she whispered. Reeves smiled. Actually smiled. Then he pulled off one glove, reached down, and slid Helen's wedding ring from her finger while she was still alive. Frank made a sound Ellie had never heard from him before. Not a shout. Not a curse. Something deeper. Something a man makes only when grief stops being memory and becomes fresh blood again. On the screen, Helen grabbed Reeves's sleeve one last time and tried to say Frank's name. Reeves peeled her fingers away. Then he stood up, turned toward the burning ravine, and walked off while she was still moving in the snow. The video cut there. The ice room went dead silent. Even Rex stopped growling for a second. Frank stared at the frozen black screen, face drained of everything except one terrible clarity. Reeves had not just killed Helen. He had watched her die. And somewhere above their heads, boots shifted over the ravine again, closer this time, just as Rex's ears snapped toward the deeper dark beyond the chamber, and the dog gave one hard bark at a second door Frank had not even noticed yet. Rex's bark cracked through the ice room, and Frank turned just in time to see the dog plant both paws against a second door, half hidden behind the hanging meat hooks and rotten crate stack, a narrow iron panel so buried in frost and shadow that no human eye would have noticed it in one quick scan. Frank crossed fast, Ellie right behind him, and found the latch welded stiff with cold until Ryan's old knife finally bit under the rust and levered it loose. The panel jerked inward with a groan, and a stream of warmer air brushed their faces, carrying diesel fumes, wet stone, and something else that did not belong under a forgotten ravine chamber, fresh cigarette smoke. Not an old emergency exit. Not some dead storage crawl. Somebody was still using this route. "Move!" Frank whispered, and Rex slipped through first without hesitation, body low, ears up, no wasted motion. The tunnel beyond was tighter than the ice room, but cleaner, lined in places with old brick, in places with raw earth, and every few feet Frank's flashlight caught something that chilled him more than the storm ever could. Fresh boot prints in the damp clay, drag marks from crates, and new electrical wire stapled along one wall where no mountain farmer had any business running power. Ellie saw it too. "This isn't hidden from them," she breathed. "They've been using it." Frank nodded once, jaw tight. That changed the route completely. They were no longer escaping through an old forgotten passage. They were crawling deeper into something Banner and Reeves already owned. Above them, muffled through layers of rock and frozen dirt, came the dull hammering of boots in the ice room as the men finally found the chamber. Too late to go back now. Frank pressed forward, lockbox under one arm, revolver in the other, while Rex kept just enough distance ahead to warn without vanishing. The tunnel bent sharply left, dropped by 3 stone steps, and opened into a narrow service alcove with 2 rusted lockers and a breaker box humming under a dim red pilot light. Rex stopped at the left locker and scratched once, hard. Frank yanked it open expecting tools, rope, maybe supplies. Instead he found a shelf of sealed evidence bags, 3 county property tags, and on the middle rack, under a film of dust, a small clear pouch with Helen Mercer's wedding ring inside it. Frank went so still Ellie thought for 1 second he had stopped breathing. The bag was marked in black ink, "Personal effects, Route 16 fatality." Nolan Reeves had not just taken the ring from Helen's hand while she was still alive. He had bagged it, tagged it, filed it, and hidden it underground like a trophy inside the same tunnel system now swallowing them whole. Frank took the ring out with fingers that suddenly felt 10 years older and 10 times steadier, slid it into his pocket, and closed the locker door with deadly care. The rage in him was no longer wild. Wild rage got men killed. This had become something colder, more useful. Ellie was staring at the other shelf. "Frank!" she whispered. He followed her gaze and saw another evidence bag, this one holding a bent silver lighter engraved with the initials TM. Ellie's face drained. "My dad's." Beside it sat a stack of memory cards, a blood-stained wallet, and 2 driver's licenses from girls the county had listed as runaways over the last 4 years. The whole tunnel seemed to contract around them. Reeves and Vanner hadn't only killed Helen. They had been collecting lives, filing them, storing them under the mountain, turning people into paperwork and objects. Rex suddenly swung away from the lockers and growled deeper down the passage, toward a thin line of light slipping under the next steel door. Voices came with it, muted at first, then clearer when Frank killed his flashlight and edged closer. One voice belonged to Cole Vanner. The other belonged to Sheriff Reeves. "The old man saw the video," Reeves was saying, annoyed now, not calm. "You should have killed him in the cabin." Vanner answered with the same dead, easy confidence Frank remembered from war zones and burned sites. "If I killed him there, I still have a girl, a dog, and a missing box. If I let him run, instinct takes him where he always takes himself, toward the truth he can't stop touching." Frank felt Ellie tense beside him. Vanner went on. "That's what makes old soldiers useful. They mistake unfinished grief for direction." Reeves spat something, metal rang, then the sheriff said, "And if he gets to the lower vault?" A pause. Then Vanner laughed softly. "He won't. Not before we move the children." Ellie's hand flew to her mouth. Frank's blood turned to ice. Children. Plural. Not Ellie alone. Not one witness, one dead father, one old murder. Something bigger. Something rotting under the county for years. Rex pressed back against Frank's leg once, firm, urgent, grounding him before the shock could slow his mind. Frank leaned to the crack at the edge of the steel door and looked through. On the other side lay a long underground loading room carved into the mountain itself, part mine tunnel, part storage bay, part holding site. Crates were stacked beside county-marked vans. 3 armed men moved near a rolling table covered in files and phones. Reeves stood beside a map board. Vanner had his coat off, sleeves rolled, one hand planted on a steel cage trolley. And beyond them, behind another chain-link partition lit by one swinging work lamp, Frank saw movement. Small shapes. Blankets. A hand gripping wire mesh. At least 4 children huddled in the far holding pen, too scared even to cry loud. Ellie made a broken sound in her throat, and Frank caught her shoulder before it escaped as a gasp. Everything clicked then in one brutal, sickening line. Helen hadn't died because she saw one dirty exchange. She died because she stumbled onto the edge of a whole underground transport route. Ellie's father hadn't been murdered for filming a payoff. He had filmed the machine. And Frank, old, isolated, half buried with his grief on a mountain, had survived long enough to become the one witness Vanner still considered dangerous because the box, the drive, and Helen's last route all pointed back to him. Reeves stepped to the map board and jabbed a finger at a spot that made Frank's spine lock cold. "If Mercer reaches Miller Quarry before dawn, he'll find the lower manifest room." Vanner's expression changed for the first time that night, not to fear,
but to the tight concentration of a man adjusting a plan under pressure.
"Then we leave now," he said. "Move the kids. Burn the tunnel. And bring me the dog alive if you can. I want the old man to watch what loyalty buys him."
Rex's growl turned savage. The steel door between them and that room was no longer just another barrier. It was the last thin piece of metal between Frank Mercer and the full truth of what had taken Helen, hunted Ellie, and spread rot beneath his county for years. Then one of the children behind the chain-link partition lifted her face into the swinging light, and Frank saw something around her neck that hit him even harder than the sight of the cage itself. It was Helen's second necklace, the small silver Saint charm she had been wearing the night she died, the one Reese had never logged, never returned, never mentioned. Ellie saw it too, and in the same instant both of them understood the chilling truth Vanner had not spoken out loud yet. Helen Mercer had not just seen the operation 6 years ago. She had been in this room. That truth hit Frank harder than the sight of the children behind the chain link, because it meant Helen's death had never been the clean roadside silencing he had tortured himself with for 6 years. She had been here. In this room. On this floor. Under the same dead mountain, close enough to touch the cages, the files, the men, and whatever bargain had gone bad the night Reeves decided she could not be allowed to leave alive. Ellie was still staring at the silver Saint charm around the little girl's neck when Rex suddenly changed. The dog's growl dropped, then cut off entirely, and he drove his body sideways into Frank's thigh with enough force to pull him away from the steel door, just before a flashlight beam sliced across the crack from the other side. Someone was coming straight for it. Frank jerked Ellie down behind the old service drum, one arm across her shoulders, the other bringing the revolver up low. Rex planted himself at the opposite side of the drum, eyes fixed on the gap, chest moving in deep, controlled pulls. No barking now. No warning. That meant the danger was already committed. The door handle turned. Stopped. Then a key slid into the lock from the loading room side, and Frank felt the whole night narrow to one single ugly choice. Stay hidden and maybe lose the children when they were moved, or hit hard now against men who still outnumbered him and knew the tunnels better than he did. Ellie must have read something on his face, because she grabbed his sleeve and whispered,
"If they take them out of that cage, they'll be gone before daylight."
Frank looked through the crack one last time. Reeves was at the map board with his back turned, one finger still moving along a route line. Vanner had shifted deeper into the room, talking low to the 3 armed men by the crates. One of them carried a ring of keys. Another had bolt cutters. The children were not being watched by luck. They were being processed. Moved. Logged. Handed off. The machinery was already rolling. Frank leaned to Ellie's ear.
"When this opens, get to the chain gate. Don't stop to think. Don't stop for me. Straight to the kids."
Her eyes widened, but she nodded. Good. No wasted words. Frank tightened his grip on the revolver, Ryan's old knife already loose in his left hand, and gave Rex the smallest hand signal he had used on working dogs overseas when there was no room left for language. Hold, then break right. Rex's ears twitched once. The key turned fully. The lock clicked. The door opened inward 3 inches, and the guard on the other side stepped in with his light low and his rifle half raised, expecting an empty passage and finding 70-year-old Frank Mercer coming out of the dark like the last bad decision of his life. Frank shot him once in the throat and drove the knife into the man's collarbone in the same motion to keep the body from slamming backward into the steel and giving the room half a second more warning than necessary. Rex blasted through the widening gap an instant later and hit the second guard at the knees so hard the man's flashlight flew across the concrete and spun wild white circles under the crates. Ellie bolted low exactly as told,
slipping through the confusion toward the chain-link partition while Reeves jerked around from the map board and Vanner's whole face changed from cold control to naked murder. "Mercer!" he barked, and then the room erupted. Frank kicked the first body into the doorway, using it as a temporary shield as rounds punched sparks off the steel frame. Rex tore the second guard off his feet and dragged him sideways into the rolling table, sending files, phones, and one county seal stamp clattering across the floor. Ellie reached the partition and fumbled for the latch just as the man with the bolt cutter swung toward her. Frank fired across the loading room, caught him in the side of the neck, and the cutter skidded spinning to Ellie's boots. "Keys!" Frank shouted, but one of the children inside the cage was already pointing frantically at the ring hanging from the dead man's belt. Good. Still alive enough to help. Reeves got to cover fast behind the van's open rear door and started firing with the precise restraint of a man who had killed before and preferred it efficient. Vanner did the opposite. He advanced. No panic. No cover obsession. Just that same smooth, hateful confidence Frank remembered from convoy nights overseas, when Vanner always moved like the room eventually belonged to him. "You should have stayed on your mountain," he said, gun up, voice almost calm again. Frank shifted left behind the service drum, kept the corpse-shielded doorway between him and the third shooter, and fired once at Vanner's center mass. Vanner dipped, the round tore through his sleeve, and the man barely seemed to notice. Reeves did. "Forget the old man," the sheriff snapped. "Move the kids!" Too late. Ellie got the keys, hands shaking so badly Frank thought she might drop them, but she jammed the right one into the chain-link gate on the third try and yanked it open. The children did not rush out. That was the worst part. They pressed back at first, too trained by fear to trust an open door. Rex saw it before Frank did. The dog released the guard he'd been mauling, ran straight to the cage, and shoved his head through the gap toward the smallest girl, the one wearing Helen's Saint charm, whining once, low and urgent, not as threat but as permission. The girl burst into tears and moved. Then the others did too. Rehook. New pressure. Now Frank wasn't just keeping Ellie alive. He was holding an underground loading room against armed men, while 4 traumatized children tried to remember how running worked. Reeves saw the collapse of his schedule and reached for something under the map table. Frank tracked the motion and shot at the table leg. The round missed Reeves but shattered a glass case hidden beneath the board. A red alarm strip burst to life across the far wall. Auto transfer lockdown. Metal shutters began sliding over the tunnel exits one by one. Vanner swore for the first time all night. "Stop the doors!" Reeves snarled back. But the system was old, mechanical, and already committed. One tunnel sealed. Then another. Then the rear loading ramp began to lower its steel gate with a grinding howl that shook the whole room. Frank understood the twist immediately. If the lockdown completed, everyone in the chamber, children, hostages, hunters, witnesses, would be trapped underground with no clean exit and no way for outside law to reach them before Vanner made the evidence disappear in 100 ugly ways. Rex barked once toward the van. Not the men. The van. Frank saw it then. County logo on the side, back doors open, interior shelving half ripped out and replaced with restraints and false panels. A transport cage on wheels sat locked inside. Human cargo. The old man's stomach turned to stone. Helen had not just seen this room. She had seen exactly what it was for. Ellie was pushing the children behind the crate stack now, trying to keep them low, when the little girl with Helen's charm grabbed her coat and cried, "They said the sheriff took the woman's ring because she scratched him." Frank's head snapped toward Reeves so fast it made his neck burn. Reeves fired at him instantly, the round slamming into the service drum inches from his ear. Frank dropped, breath knocked sideways, and Vanner used that second to move again. He came around the van,
closer now, gun steady, rainwater still drying on his coat, one eye fixed on Frank and the other on the children.
"You know what your problem is,"
Vanner said over the grinding lockdown alarms.
"You still think this ends if you kill the right man."
Frank rose just enough to aim.
"No,"
he said, voice low and lethal.
"Now I think it ends when every buried thing comes up."
The two men fired at the same time. Frank felt hot pain rip through the flesh high along his left shoulder. Not a kill shot, bad enough to weaken the arm. Vanner's shot went wide because Rex hit his wrist mid-trigger in another blur of black and tan fury and teeth. The pistol flew. Vanner drove his knee into the dog's ribs, and they both crashed into the side of the van. Ree shouted for the last guard, but the last guard never moved, because one of the older boys Frank had not even fully seen yet swung the dropped bolt cutters into the man's shin from behind the crate stack and sent him sprawling into the half-closed gate. That was the first tiny reversal the room had given them. Then the steel ramp door slammed 3/4 shut with a thunderous crash, and everyone in the chamber heard the same new sound at the same time, heavy water roaring to life in the pipes above the ceiling. Rees went pale before anybody else understood why.
"No,"
he said. Not command now. Fear. Actual fear. Frank followed Rex's eyes to the red strip over the map board and read the words that made the whole underground system shift into an even worse shape. Fire suppression reservoir release. The old lockbox nearly slipped from his numb fingers, because suddenly he knew exactly what was about to happen. This mountain did not just hide tunnels. It hid flood channels. And in a room full of caged transport vans, locked exits, children, and live electrical rails, water was about to come pouring down. The first burst hit the ceiling pipes so hard it sounded like the mountain itself had cracked open above them, and then the water came down in white violent sheets, hammering the loading room, flooding papers, slamming work lights into sparks, and turning the concrete floor into a black rushing mirror in under 3 seconds. The children screamed and backed into each other behind the crate stack. Ellie grabbed the smallest girl by the shoulders, and Frank moved on pure instinct, old body or not, because hesitation in a flooding room killed faster than bullets.
"Up!"
he roared, pointing at the county van with the gutted cargo cage.
"Get on the van! Off the floor now!"
The older boy moved first this time, shoving the two youngest toward the open rear doors, and that one brave movement broke the others loose. Good. Motion meant life. Frank splashed across the current toward them just as a live wire dropped from the sparking breaker strip and snapped into the water beside his boot. Rex hit him so hard in the hip he half-turned, and the current cracked blue where his leg had been a heartbeat earlier. Good dog. Again. Always one beat ahead. The shepherd landed, spun, and immediately drove toward the children, barking short and sharp, hurting them toward the van's rubber tires and steel frame instead of the electrified floor. Vanner saw the same thing Frank did and changed target at once. He stopped firing at the old man and swung toward the transport van because the van was no longer just cover, it was survival. Frank caught the motion and fired first. The round tore through Vanner's side and spun him into the cage trolley, but the man stayed on his feet out of pure malice and training. Reeves did not. The sheriff had gone pale the moment the suppression release kicked in, and now he was no longer acting like the room belonged to him. He was acting like he needed something in it before the water took it away. That told Frank more than any confession. Reeves shoved past the map table, splashed through the current, and made for the far wall where a locked steel hatch sat half hidden behind the county file racks. Not the exit. Not the children. Not Vanner. Something else. Something buried.
"He's going for records!"
Ellie shouted, dragging the little girl with Helen's charm up into the van, while the older boy hauled another child after them. The room shook as the half-closed ramp gates slammed lower under the flood pressure. Water was at Frank's knees now, rising hard, dragging loose files and shell casings around his legs. Rex wheeled from the van to Frank to Reeves, trying to choose the greater danger, and Frank made the choice for him.
"Kids!"
he barked, stabbing one finger toward Ellie. Rex obeyed instantly, splashing toward the van and planting himself beside the rear bumper like a guard tower with teeth. Vanner cursed and came again, lower this time, one hand clamped over his bleeding side, the other reaching for a dropped pistol skating in the water. Frank met him halfway. The old man's shoulder was on fire, his ribs hurt, and his left hand had gone half numb from cold and recoil, but age had not taken the knowledge of where to hurt another man. He drove Ryan's knife upward under Vanner's forearm, ripped the pistol away, and smashed the man face first into the side of the transport cage. Metal rang. Teeth cracked. Vanner came back anyway, because some men only got more dangerous when pain stripped the mask off. They hit the flood together, boots slipping, bodies slamming against the van while the children cried inside, and Ellie fought to keep them low behind the shelving. Reeves reached the far hatch and punched a code into the panel with wet, frantic fingers. That was the moment Frank knew the sheriff had always been more afraid of truth than of witnesses. The hatch light turned green. Reeves yanked it open, and a blast of colder, deeper air rolled out from a chamber below the loading room. Lower vault. Lower manifest. Whatever it was, it mattered more to him than escaping the flood.
"Cole!"
Reeves shouted, voice breaking for the first time.
"Help me move the ledgers."
Vanner actually laughed in Frank's face when he heard it, bloody and breathless and still fighting.
"You stupid bastard,"
he rasped.
"You still think paper is what kills you."
Then he shoved off Frank, not toward Reeves, but toward the van, because Vanner had seen something else. The county transport vehicle was beginning to shift under the flood. Not floating yet, but lifting enough on one side that the wheel locks could fail, and send the whole thing crashing sideways into the children. Frank saw it too, just as the smallest girl lost her footing and slid toward the open rear edge. Rex moved before any human could. He lunged up into the van, caught the back of the girl's coat gently but hard enough to stop her, and dragged her against Ellie's legs a split second before the van rocked under another surge. The little girl burst into sobs and wrapped both arms around his neck. Rex stayed there, half braced, half holding her, while the water kept climbing. Frank's chest tightened so hard it almost stole his breath. That dog was not just fighting enemies anymore. He was choosing lives. Reeves came staggering back from the hatch with 2 black binders, and a metal cash box jammed under one arm. So that was it. Not just old files. Portable proof. The sheriff had been keeping a kill switch archive underground all these years. One small box that could erase half a county if he got it out. Ellie saw the binders and shouted,
"Frank! Stop him!"
Frank turned, but Vanner cut across him like a knife. Not to protect Reeves. To steal the box for himself. The alliance had finally broken where greed always breaks it, at the exact weight of truth each man wanted to control alone. Reeves fired first at Vanner. Vanner ducked. The round blew through the hanging chain line over the map board, and 3 steel file cabinets toppled at once into the flood. One slammed into the half-lowered ramp gate. Another crushed the map table. The third hit the floor great dead center of the room with such force that the old rusted bolts sheared clean off. The grate dropped 2 inches, groaned, then tore open entirely under the pressure of the water. A whirlpool formed at once in the middle of the loading room, sucking files, crates, and loose tools downward into the black opening beneath. Frank felt the current change direction around his boots. So did Reeves, and real terror finally hit the sheriff's face.
"No!"
he shouted, lunging not for the children, not for the exit, but for the binders, as one of them slid from his grip and spun toward the opening. The black binder hit the water,
cracked open, and pages burst upward in a wet fan across the room. One slapped against the van tire inches from Frank's leg. He looked down on instinct. County Transfer Log, Sublevel B. His eyes caught one line before the page ripped free and twisted away in the flood. Mercer, Helen, received alive, hold for special handoff. The world did not stop. It became worse. Helen had not died on the road. She had been brought down here alive. Frank stared at the line for one impossible second, and Reeves saw him see it. The sheriff's whole face collapsed into something raw and ugly and cornered. "She should have minded her own business," he screamed. Then the second binder slipped from his arm. The flood took it, and somewhere beneath the torn grate a deeper steel door boomed open under the pressure release, revealing one more level below. Not a drain. Not a sump. A chamber. And from the darkness under the loading room, through spray and spitting paper and the roar of the flood, a woman's recorded voice suddenly burst to life over hidden speakers tripped by the broken circuit. Frank knew the voice before the first full word landed. Helen. "If Frank ever hears this," she said from somewhere under the mountain, calm and shaking and alive in the recording, "then I didn't die on the road. If Frank ever hears this," Helen's voice said from somewhere under the mountain, calm and shaking and alive in the recording, "then I didn't die on the road. Reeves brought me below Miller Quarry after the crash. Cole wanted the box, but Reeves wanted the route list. If they still use the children's line, the lower chamber is under the flood grate. There's a second cage room beneath the transport bay. Don't let them open shaft B." The whole loading room seemed to stop breathing for one savage second. Even the water roaring around Frank's knees felt suddenly colder, because Helen wasn't just naming her own murder now. She was reaching across 6 buried years to warn him that the machine still existed, still moved children, still had another level under the floor they were already standing on. Reeves heard the same line and lost what was left of his mask. "Kill the speaker!" he shouted, but there was no single speaker to kill. Helen's voice was coming through the whole old system now, bouncing off rusted ducts and hidden maintenance grills, turning the mountain itself against the lie. "The second ledger is in the chamber below," her recording continued. "If the flood opens the grate, the current will feed shaft B first. They use the lower rails to move them out before dawn." Vanner's head snapped toward the torn floor opening at once. There it was. The real prize. Not just papers. Not just witnesses. A second chamber, a second route, a second system he needed either to clear or destroy before anybody alive got eyes on it. Frank saw the decision hit him and moved before he could act on it. He splashed through the waist-high current toward the center of the room, just as the floor grate tore wider under the pressure, and a steel access ladder rose into view beneath the black water, leading down into a lower shaft lit by one flickering amber maintenance lamp. Reeves lunged for it from the far side. Vanner lunged too. Not together. Not allies now. Predators fighting over the same throat. Frank met Reeves first, and slammed him sideways into the submerged rail post hard enough to rip the black binder out of the sheriff's hand. Pages burst loose into the flood like white birds. Reeves clawed for Frank's face, not for freedom, not for a weapon, but for the binder, and that told Frank everything. This wasn't just proof anymore. It was insurance. The sheriff had buried enough names in those pages to hang half the county, or by the silence of the half that survived. Frank drove his forearm into Reeves's jaw and sent him spinning into the van wheel, but Vanner had already reached the open shaft. He dropped to one knee at the edge and thrust both hands into the rushing water below, trying to grab something fixed just under the ladder lip. Hidden lever. Emergency release? Of course. The man always knew where the room's real throat was. "Rex!" Frank barked, and the shepherd launched off the transport van without hesitation,
water exploding under his chest as he cut across the current toward Vanner. One of the children screamed when a live wire snapped free from the ceiling rail and hit the flood beside the crate stack in a shower of blue-white crackle. Ellie saw it before Frank could turn. She shoved the two youngest higher onto the van shelves, threw herself across the older boy, and dragged them all toward the dry corner near the roofline just as current forked through the water where they'd been huddled. Good. Moving. Thinking. Surviving. Frank tore the binder up onto a crate, jammed it under his coat, and turned back just in time to see Rex hit Vanner high in the shoulders and rip him off the shaft lip before the man could wrench the hidden release. They crashed into the half-submerged cage trolley together, metal skidding, water surging, Vanner cursing through blood and spray. Reeves came up with a backup revolver from his ankle holster and aimed not at Frank, but at the dog. Frank shot first. The round clipped Reeves's wrist and sent the revolver spinning across the flooded floor, but the sheriff did not even cry out. He dove instead for the black cash box he had dropped when the grate blew. Whatever was in that box mattered to him more than his own hand. Helen's voice kept going through the hidden speakers, broken now by static and age, but still clear enough to carve the room apart.
If they tell Frank I died at the ravine, they're lying.
They brought me below, and Reeves took my ring before he sent me down. Cole said the old man would never stop digging if I vanished clean. Reeves said then we make him bury weather, not murder.
The words hit Reeves harder than the bullet had. He looked up at the ceiling like the dead had become physically present in the room, and for the first time since Frank had seen him on the road that night, the sheriff looked frightened in a human way instead of a hunted animal way.
Shut it off,
he screamed to nobody who could still obey him. The mountain answered with more water. The suppression flow surged again, hammering the lowered ramp gate and driving the flood up above Frank's thighs. The transport van shifted on its suspension with a sickening lurch. Ellie grabbed the frame. The children screamed. If the van floated or rolled, they were done. Vanner saw that too and changed target instantly. He kicked free of Rex, slammed an elbow into the dog's injured shoulder, and stumbled toward the van not to save anyone, but to use the tilt. If he rocked the transport hard enough, he could dump the children, force Frank and Ellie to choose, and buy the shaft below. Frank intercepted him with everything old age had left and everything grief had sharpened. The two men hit the side doors of the van together, water slamming at their legs, fists and knees, and shoulders working in the ugly close rhythm of men who hated each other too long to fight pretty. Vanner drove a thumb into Frank's wounded shoulder and nearly dropped him. Frank answered by smashing Ryan's knife hilt into Vanner's mouth and hearing teeth break. Rex came again despite the pain in his side, clamping onto Vanner's coat sleeve and dragging the man off balance just as the transport van gave a second violent lurch. A crate broke loose and slammed into the open shaft. The hidden release lever Vanner had reached for snapped upward on impact. Somewhere below, deep steel groaned. Ellie's face went white. "Frank!"
she shouted.
"Shaft B!"
Too late. The lower chamber door beneath the ladder boomed open under flood pressure, and the current in the loading room changed direction all at once. It stopped rising straight and began pulling. Hard. Everything loose on the floor, files, shell casings, a broken chair leg, one dead guard's flashlight, shot toward the opening in a spinning rush. Reeves saw his black cash box sliding away and lunged after it on pure panic. Frank saw the same current tug at the transport van's rear tire. One more shift and the whole vehicle would nose toward the opening, with the children still inside. Rex braced at the van frame and barked with savage urgency, not at Frank, not at Vanner, but down into the open shaft below. Frank followed the line and saw what the dog had seen first. Beneath the ladder, below the swirling water, another cage room was coming into view through the amber light, smaller, older, and still occupied.
There were people down there. Not records. Not ghosts. Living people. And just as Reeves grabbed the cash box and looked up with murder and terror fighting in his face, a child's hand rose through the lower bars from the chamber beneath the flood and started pounding against the metal from below. The child's hand kept pounding against the lower bars, small palms slapping wet metal through the spray, and that was the moment Frank Mercer stopped thinking about evidence, revenge, or even Sheriff Reeves's face, and made the only choice that still let him live with himself in the morning. He shoved the black binder up onto the van floor, looked once at Ellie, and barked, "Hold the kids high and tie that axle to the rail." She did not waste a second asking how. She grabbed the older boy, shoved him toward the chain spool bolted near the loading post, and together they started wrapping steel links through the van frame, while the younger children clung to the shelving and Rex braced at the wheel well, body between them and the flood. Frank hit the open shaft ladder just as Reeves lunged for the black cash box again, and Vanner, bleeding from the side and mouth, drove himself off the waterlogged concrete toward the same opening from the opposite angle. None of them were moving for the same reason now. Frank wanted the people alive. Reeves wanted whatever was buried below to stay buried. Vanner wanted control of the route before anybody else could touch it. The old man dropped hard into the lower chamber, boots splashing into black water that only reached his shins there, lower than above, but rising fast through the grates. The amber maintenance lamp flickered over a second cage room no larger than a butcher's freezer. 3 more children crowded inside, one teenage boy shielding the smallest with both arms, and in the far corner, half collapsed against the chain link, a woman in a county transport jacket with dried blood at her temple and one eye swollen nearly shut. Not dead. Not ghost. Alive. She saw Frank through the bars and tried to stand on legs that would not cooperate. "Mercer?" she rasped, disbelief and desperate hope colliding in one ruined word. Frank knew her a second later, even under the bruises. Dana Hollowell, assistant clerk from the county records office, missing for 9 days, printed on every pole in town as walked away voluntarily. Reeves had not only been moving children. He had been disappearing adults who could read paperwork. "Keys?" Frank shouted. Dana lifted a shaking hand toward the underside of the ladder rung above him. "Tape," she whispered. "Helen put them there." That sentence cut straight through him, but there was no room to stop. He reached under the rusted rung, found a ring of old brass keys wrapped in black electrician's tape, and for one brutal second he had to look away because Helen's fingers had hidden him here, alive, terrified, still working against the men who would kill her. Water thundered overhead. Above the shaft, Reeves was shouting at Ellie to give him the binder. Vanner was shouting at Reeves to move off the lip. Their alliance was finally rotting in the open. Frank jammed the second key into the cage lock. It stuck, then turned. The chain gate sprang loose. The teenage boy caught Dana before she hit the floor, and the little girl nearest Frank grabbed his sleeve with both wet hands and cried, "The dog saved us too!" He looked up instinctively. Rex was still above, still braced against the van, but the words mattered because they meant the children had seen him, trusted him, and were still capable of believing in rescue. Frank hauled the gate wide, pointed to the ladder, and said, "One at a time, no slipping, no screaming, eyes on me." The older boy nodded and obeyed like a soldier too young to have learned the trick yet. Dana caught Frank's wrist as he turned to lift the first child. "Reeves has the master ledger page in the box," she whispered. "Not the binder. The box. New twist. New shape." Frank's whole body tightened. The binder mattered. The cash box was the kill switch. Of course. Reeves would never run for simple money, while a flood tried to tear his room apart. He was running for the one thing small enough to carry, and deadly enough to erase everyone else. Above them came Rex's deepest bark of the night,
followed by the sound of a body hitting steel. Frank looked up through the shaft and saw chaos in slices between the ladder rails. Ellie and the older rescued boy had the van chained off to the loading post. Two of the upper children were tucked under the roof shelves. Reeves had one hand on the cash box and the other on a submerged support beam, trying to keep the current from spitting him into the opening, and Vanner had stopped pretending to chase the box at all. He had realized something else. The lower chamber had another exit, a narrow rail tunnel at the back, half hidden by a maintenance curtain and old ore tracks vanishing into darkness. Helen's recording had named it Shaft B. Vanner was angling toward that curtain now, with murder in his face, and Reeves's spare sidearm clenched in his fist. Rex launched for him at once, but the dog was forced to choose between the moving gunman and the transport van rocking harder under each new surge. He looked back once toward the children. That one glance was enough to tell Frank how thin the margin had become.
"Ellie!"
Frank shouted up through the shaft.
"Take the lower kids up the ladder, then hold the tunnel."
Ellie dropped to her knees at the opening and reached down for the first child without even looking at the water, or the gunfire, or the sheriff clawing in the flood beside her. "Good. Steady." Dana shoved the smallest girl into Frank's arms, and he lifted her high enough for Ellie to grab. The next child came. Then the next. Reeves saw the rescue becoming real and snapped,
"Vanner, now!"
But Vanner no longer obeyed anybody. He pivoted at the edge of Shaft B, fired once into the ceiling control cluster over the loading bay, and blew the remaining work lights into sparks. Half the room dropped into pulsing red emergency glow. The half-closed ramp gate shuddered and stopped moving. The catwalk alarm died. The flood pumps hiccuped. Vanner had not just killed the lights. He had severed the sheriff's control over the room. Reeves understood it a heartbeat later and screamed something raw and panicked that Frank had never expected to hear from him. Then Rex chose. The dog drove off the van and hit Vanner square at the elbow before the man could fire a second shot toward the shaft. The pistol discharged wild into the rail wall. Vanner spun, smashed the sidearm into Rex's skull, and for one horrible second the dog vanished into the red-lit spray. Frank nearly abandoned the ladder right there, but Dana shoved the last lower child upward and barked,
"Go! I've got the clerk's satchel."
She was holding a waterproof County Courier bag Frank hadn't even seen in the lower cage corner. Inside, as she thrust it against his chest, were stamped transfer sheets, duplicate seal plates, and a slim cassette recorder with Helen Mercer's name written across the label in black pen. Near resolution suddenly felt close enough to breathe. The kids were coming up. Dana was alive. The satchel was in his hands. Reeves was losing the room. Frank hit the ladder with the last child ahead of him, and came over the lip into the upper loading bay just as Rex reappeared out of the red dark and slammed Vanner sideways into the rail tunnel curtain. The old man thought, for one dangerous instant, that they had it. Ellie had the children clustered high and chained safe. The binder was on the van. Dana was climbing. Reeves was wounded and half-drowned. Vanner was off balance. Then Sheriff Reeves stopped reaching for the cash box and reached instead under the map table where the flood had torn one panel loose. He came up with a yellow key fob the size of a garage remote, looked straight at Frank through the red strobe light, and smiled with all the wrong teeth.
"You're still rescuing the room you can see,"
he said, and thumbed the button. Deep in Shaft B, beyond the maintenance curtain, an engine coughed to life on the buried rails. The sound rolled out of the tunnel like iron waking underground, and Ellie turned toward it just in time to see a black transport car glide out of the darkness, with its cargo cage already loaded, already locked, and one terrified child inside pounding both fists against the bars from behind the mesh. Reeves had kept one last transfer ready in the dark all along. The black transport cart came fully out of Shaft B with its steel wheels shrieking on the buried rails, the cargo cage already locked, one terrified boy inside hammering both fists against the mesh, and Sheriff Reeves splashing toward it with the cash box clutched to his chest like that one small metal case mattered more than every child in the mountain. Dana saw the layout first and shouted over the flood.
"If that cart clears the turnout, it goes straight to the quarry lift."
Ellie snapped toward the older rescued boy and barked,
"Keep them on the van, keep them high, don't let anybody jump."
While Rex wheeled from the transport axle to the moving rail cart and then back to Frank, trying to pull the old man's eyes to something under the water Frank hadn't seen yet. 70-year-old Frank Mercer drove himself through the current toward the track anyway, but the shepherd slammed into his knee so hard it spun him sideways, just as a blue-white arc cracked across the flood, where the rails disappeared under the water. Live current. Reeves had electrified the obvious path. Good dog. Again. Always one beat before death. Rex barked once toward the side loading frame instead, where a narrow maintenance catwalk ran above the rail line toward the cart's brake housing. Frank understood instantly, shoved the black binder and Dana's satchel up onto the van floor, and hauled himself onto the catwalk rungs with his wounded shoulder screaming. Below him Reeves reached the cart cab, clawed the side door open, and half threw himself in with the cash box while the caged boy inside sobbed and pounded at the bars.
"You're not taking him anywhere!"
Ellie screamed, but Reeves had already hit the throttle override with his good hand. The cart lurched harder, nose angling toward the tunnel throat. That was when Cole Vanner finally dropped all pretense. He no longer wanted the sheriff alive, the county safe, or the operation quiet. He wanted the box, the route, and the last clean way out. He splashed after the cart with murder in his face, one blood-slick hand on the rail line, the other raising Reeves's spare pistol toward the cab window. Frank saw him, shifted on the catwalk, and fired downward. The round blew sparks off the steel brace inches from Vanner's jaw, enough to stagger him, not enough to stop him. Vanner looked up and smiled through broken teeth like the whole flooded room still belonged to the man with the least conscience.
"You're too late, old man,"
he shouted.
"You always were."
Then he fired back. The round punched through the catwalk rail and ripped hot across Frank's upper arm, spinning him hard enough that one boot slipped off the rung into open space. For one cold instant, he was hanging by one hand over the electrified flood and the moving cart below, shoulder tearing, ribs on fire, age and blood loss finally cashing their bill. Rex didn't hesitate. The German shepherd hit Vanner from the side, like a black antenna hammer, jaws locking onto the gun wrist and dragging the muzzle up before the second shot could take Frank out of the air. Vanner screamed, swung wildly, and both of them crashed against the side of the moving cart. Frank got his footing back, climbed higher, and reached the brake housing at the front corner just as Dana's voice cut across the room.
"The cassette!"
she yelled.
"Helen said brake chain under the east beam."
Ellie was already ripping through the satchel on the van roofline, soaked hair in her face. Children pressed around her, while Dana shoved one of the recovered county radios toward the tablet and screamed into it for North District state units. Not county, not local, not anybody Reeves owned. The flooded loading bay had become 3 battles at once. Children trying not to drown, truth trying not to vanish, and one elderly man climbing a shaking catwalk after a moving cage because his dog had saved him from the easy route one last time. Ellie found the cassette recorder, hit play, and Helen Mercer's voice burst back through the old room speakers under static and flood roar.
"If Frank reaches the rail cart,"
she said, calm and urgent through 6 years of burial,
"the manual brake chain is tucked under the east support beam, not on the front housing."
Cole moved the visible one as a decoy.
Frank almost laughed from the pure fury and love of it. Even dead, Helen was still laying traps against the men who killed her. He ducked under the front brace, ignored the fake chain hanging where Reeves would expect a pursuer to grab it, and reached deeper under the east beam until his numb fingers found a grease-caked loop hidden behind the axle guard. Above the flood, Reeves saw what Frank was doing and thrust the pistol through the cab bars toward the old man's face.
"You should have buried the box and your wife with the weather,"
the sheriff snarled. He fired. The shot would have taken Frank through the throat if Rex hadn't launched off Vanner's chest at that exact second and hit the side of the cab hard enough to jolt Reeves's aim. The round blew out the lamp behind Frank instead. Darkness slammed over the rail line, broken only by red emergency strobes and the blue spit of live current on the water. Frank yanked the real brake chain with both hands. Nothing. He planted one boot, hauled again, and felt the mechanism begin to give with a scream of rusted steel. The cart slowed for half a second, then bucked forward even harder. Reeves had locked out the manual brake from inside. New twist. New danger. Vanner, bleeding and half mad now, tore free of Rex and lunged not for Frank, but for the dog, because he finally understood what made the old man dangerous. Loyalty. The thing he could never buy and never predict. He dragged a knife from his boot and drove at Rex's ribs. Frank dropped from the catwalk onto the cart roof, hit the cab frame with both boots, and fired through the side glass at close range. The round tore across Vanner's shoulder and spun him backward into the flood path just as the current under the open shaft surged again. Vanner grabbed once for the rail, missed, and vanished waist-deep into the whirl at the torn grate, clawing for purchase on the very route he had built to move other people in chains. Rex reached the edge first, barking savagely, not to save him, but to drive him from the cart and away from Frank. The next surge took Vanner under the steel lip and dragged him screaming into Shaft B's black mouth. It was the ugliest kind of justice, and exactly the kind men like him left behind. Reeves saw Vanner disappear, and something inside him finally broke. He swung the cab door open, trying to scramble out with the cash box, but the moving cart had already hit the turnout switch. The cage slammed sideways, the boy inside cried out, and Reeves lost his footing on the wet step. Frank hit him mid-fall. The two men crashed onto the outer platform of the cart, one old soldier, one county sheriff, both soaked to the bone and lit red by alarm light, while the rail car jerked toward the quarry tunnel. Reeves still had the box. Frank still had one hand on the brake chain housing, and one chance to keep the whole rig from vanishing underground. Reeves headbutted him, thumbed at his bad shoulder, and snarled, "You don't stop this, Mercer. Not after all this time." Frank answered by slamming Helen's ring hand, his left, the one that had carried grief 6 years too long, straight across the sheriff's mouth. Teeth snapped. The cash box slipped. Reeves grabbed for it with both hands, and that was his mistake. Frank let go of the man and reached instead for the emergency wheel welded under the cart step, the kind of mechanical kill switch old mountain systems used before electronics replaced sense. He spun it once. Jammed. Twice. Still jammed. Reeves laughed blood through his teeth, because he knew the old wheel had been locked for years. Then Rex appeared in the narrow gap beside the cart, running the side beam above electrified water like he had been born on moving steel, and drove his shoulder into Frank's hip, not toward the wheel, but lower, toward a rusted cotter pin hidden beneath the plate. Helen had hidden keys under ladder rungs. Walter had hidden tape in tins. The dog was still finding the last invisible thing in every room. Frank ripped the pin free. The kill wheel dropped loose in his hand. One savage turn. Then another. The axle screamed. The cart shuddered. Sparks blew off the rail, and the whole transport rig ground to a stop less than 6 feet from the open quarry tunnel drop. Silence did not come. The children were crying, water was still roaring, alarm still pulsing, Dana still calling state through the radio, Ellie still holding the upper kids on the van. But the cart had stopped. The boy in the cage was alive. Frank turned back just as Reeves made one last dive for the cash box. Rex hit him first. Not a killing hit. Better. A perfect chest-high strike that drove the sheriff flat onto the cart deck and pinned his gun arm under his own body, while Frank brought Ryan's old zip ties around both wrists and wrenched them so tight Reeves actually screamed. "Helen Mercer," Frank said, leaning close enough that the sheriff had to see exactly who had survived him. "Say her name where daylight can hear you." Reeves spat blood, floodwater, and one final lie, but it died weak in his mouth now. Behind them, Ellie had done the other impossible thing. She got the tablet linked through Dana's radio uplink and sent Helen's recording, the transport logs, the lower chamber files, and Dana's county seal copies straight to North District and State Child Crimes before anybody left in Ashwood County could cut a line or pull a plug. By the time the first state trooper convoy hit the quarry road at dawn, the mountain was already vomiting truth. They found 7 children alive between the loading bay and the lower cage room, Dana Hollowell alive, Ellie alive, the black binder, and the cash box both recovered. Nolan Reeves bound on the rail cart with enough evidence around him to bury a courthouse, and Cole Vanner gone into the very shaft he had spent years using to erase other people. The county called it an operation. The state called it trafficking, murder, conspiracy, falsified death reports, and enough federal charges to black out half a page. Frank called it 6 years too late. By sunrise, the old man sat on the quarry loading step with a blanket over his shoulders, Helen's wedding ring in his palm, his dead wife's St. Charm back from the little girl who had worn it as borrowed courage, and Rex pressed full against his leg, shoulder bleeding through a field wrap, ribs bruised, muzzle cut, eyes still scanning every road, boot, and shadow as if the enemies might yet get one last try. Ellie came over first, knelt in front of the dog, and buried her face in his neck because she had no words big enough for what he had done. Then she looked up at Frank with tears and storm grit still on her face and said the only true thing left. "He saved you first," she whispered. Frank looked down at Rex, at the scars, the wet fur, the steady amber eyes that had red bullets, wires, flood channels, vents, rails, and men better than any human in that mountain ever had, and something old and broken in him finally eased. "Yeah," he said, hands settling into the thick fur at the dog's neck while sirens and daylight climbed the ridge together. "He did." By noon, Helen Mercer's death certificate was being amended. Ryan's old suspicions were being reopened as homicide evidence. The county clerks were crying into microphones, and every buried route under Ashwood had men in hard hats and federal jackets walking it in broad day. Frank watched the mountain give up what it had hidden. Children carried into ambulances instead of vans, evidence tagged instead of burned, and one loyal German shepherd finally lowering his head onto the old man's knee because the fight was over and his owner was still alive. That was how a dog saved his elderly owner from deadly enemies, not once, not by accident, but over and over, until every obvious path to death had been blocked, every hidden truth had been forced into light, and the old man who thought grief was all he had left found himself driving down off the mountain with survivors in the convoy behind him, justice in the evidence boxes, his wife's ring in his pocket, and Rex in the passenger seat where no enemy would ever reach him first again.